Certain basic rights should be protected. Before I address this point, I want to unpick the question somewhat because I think we really have to ask ourselves what is basic and what is a right in our society. In The Rule of Law, this key book that I think helps us to understand a bit better how politicians might act and an ethical framework for understanding how they might make decisions. Lord Bingham cites St. Paul in saying that St. Paul rejected discrimination, saying that there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, neither male nor female, for we're all one in Christ Jesus. Yet St. Paul's society was one that accepted slavery, discriminated against women, and gave special rights to Roman citizens. I think we would all certainly say that the world has advanced quite significantly since the days of the Romans. But even in this country, within the last 70 years, we've seen homosexuality as a mental health disorder, and women were only given the right to vote in 1928. So the idea of basic rights is one that is time affected, it's temporal, it changes over time, and that's one of the points that I think is important to address. So certain basic rights should be protected. I think with majority rule, rule of the people, democracy, there is a fundamental issue, and that was reflected by John Stuart Mill in his work on liberty, where he was saying that the electorate can pursue its objectives to the detriment of minorities. And that's the first point I'd like to address you on. One of the ways in which you can ensure the safety and security of minority groups in a society is by putting a backstop on governmental action that might harm them, where the majority seeks for those things to happen. I hate to be overly reductive, but the key example is obviously Nazi Germany, where a government that was chosen by the people chose to oppress the rights of minorities. And the end result of that was the institutional framework that was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that essentially said that government activity should be checked along a series of axes that are necessary for the safety and security of the people, and for ensuring that where there are disputes, genuine disputes about the role of government, that those are able to be heard, thus giving people civil and political rights. So I'd certainly say that the right to life, the prohibition of torture, the ability to associate with others and to express yourselves, which are enshrined in UK law through the European Convention on Human Rights and Human Rights Act, might be, in a contemporary sense, where we think basic rights that should be protected are. And with those rights protected, individuals are able to challenge and question the government. They're able to be active citizens. They're able to suggest proposals for law reform so you can change some of the rules that govern the politicians' activity. And as such, fundamental human rights, especially of a civil and political nature, might be said to be some of those basic rights that should be protected. I wanted to move on a little bit to start thinking about Proposition F as well, and how policymakers should have to operate within agreed standards of good behaviour. Why is it important that we think policymakers do have standards of good behaviour? Well, there are often questions of public trust in the level of trust that citizens have in their politicians. And there have been many high-profile incidents, especially since the 60s, of so-called political sleaze, where politicians have not covered themselves in glory and fallen beneath the standards that people think or impute to those positions. So Lord Nolan, for example, is one of the people who's come up with what one of those frameworks might be in his 1995 work around the standards of public life, essentially reflecting the idea that politicians should be doing it because they want to do it and not for the side interests or other reasons that they might benefit from as a result of some of the relationships that they're able to build in office. So his framework for what you should do in public life, the Nolan principles, essentially said that politicians should be selfless, that they should act with integrity, that there should be objectivity, that they should be accountable, open, honest, and reflect leadership in their activities. And I think that we can all think about that as an ideal that politicians might strive to reflect and adopt in order to increase public confidence and trust in the decisions that they're making, and also in the office of, well, Parliament and the executive where our MPs are. One of the things that we might also think about is how government is constrained in a legal sense to act within good behaviour. And there are some quite restrictive constraints that determine how the government should make decisions that have legal consequences. The most important of these, I think, are the constraints of public law. Public law essentially requires three principal things when politicians are making decisions. The first of those is that where they make a decision, they should have the power to make that decision. And that prevents the government from acting in an arbitrary way and going much further than the detailed powers that Parliament has given them. This can be very important as it is one of the principal grounds upon which people challenge the actions of the executive. Another idea is that when there are administrative or political decisions that are made, they should be rational. And what rationality means in that context is that you shouldn't be making decisions without all of the information in front of you. You should not consider information that is irrelevant when passing a law, when deciding whether people should receive universal credit, when deporting people, etc. And finally, that another decision maker with the same information should have been able to come to that amongst other decisions. And the final constraint of public law is that there shouldn't be anything improper in the way that politicians come to decisions. So that links back to some of these Nolan principles. Politicians are unable to be biased in the way that they make decisions. They shouldn't have a financial or other stake in the programs that they're running, etc. And those are ways to make sure that politicians in England and Wales don't have their decisions annulled by the courts through their powers of judicial review. I also think it's important because it ensures that there is more buy-in from other institutions that have to help and support government in the decisions that it makes. And the overarching idea that decisions made by politicians might be susceptible to challenge by the courts is often using some of my ear to the streets information, subject to a comment in the civil service that let's make sure we do this properly because we don't want to get JR'd, i.e. judicial reviewed. So from my external perspective, it might also help to improve the quality of the decisions that are being made by the administration as well. There are a couple of other things that I think operate on the periphery around some of the standards that politicians should have to exhibit in public office. And one of the ones that has come to light in the media, there was a big social media campaign about it recently, is this idea of holding politicians to account for misfeasance in public office or doing things that they shouldn't do, for which they should be legally accountable. This is, again, one of the peripheral ways that politicians are held to account by the courts, but it's something that has very rarely been invoked, and I don't think has successfully been invoked in the last 100 years or so. I think the thing I'd like to leave you on is that the overall impact of arbitrary or irrational or poor decision making in the UK government can have really serious implications, not just domestically, but abroad as well. We have the, depending on who you talk to, 8th strongest, largest military power in the world. And increasingly, the application of international humanitarian law seeks to constrain the actions of British armed forces and soldiers, again, in countries that are far away from here. So that is, again, another constraint that bears particularly upon politicians making foreign policy decisions. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for listening to another talk, hopefully not too boring.